We'll use that as a segue to Bryan Powell's talk. Welcome my close neighbor, Bryan Powell from Montclair State University, who's going to be talking with us about community music, popular music education, and eudaimonia. Bryan, whenever you're ready.
All right, thank you. Yeah, please feel free to eat. I know it's about that time for some of us on the call. So yes, I work at Montclair State University. I wish that we were all there in person. I can vouch for the cookies that Marissa talked about earlier. So if for no other reason than that, you should come give us a visit at some point in the future. Thanks to Gareth and Marissa for putting this together. I want to start with a little context. Oh, I'm going to start my timer so that Gareth doesn't have to rudely cut me off abruptly. There we go. And give you a little background. I was just going to include 2 pictures in this, and then June started talking about the American adherence to the marching band experience, and so I decided to throw in a high school marching band photo for you. That quick backstory, my father was a band director. I was raised in that tradition, and I thought that's what I was going to do, and I got a job in East Harlem and quickly found out that the experiences that had worked for me as a music student weren't really connecting with those students, and so I got into popular music and music technology as a way to bridge that gap between school music and you know, what music looks like in society. At the same time, I started running what we called the East Harlem Community Music Crew. And I was using the term community music, and I'll admit I didn't really know what that term meant in the larger kind of academic sphere. It was just, I wanted to get the community together to make some music, and it turns out that it was a cool thing, but at the time it was just a way for, again, us to get together and engage with the community. And so with another music educator who shared a building with me in New York City, we would get together. It was intergenerational. I'll talk a little bit more about it moving forward. And from my experiences with community music and popular music education in schools, I started noticing a lot of connections. You know, it was using participant-preferred musics. It was about meaningful engagement rather than excellence. And so for a number of years, I've been kind of thinking through what are the similarities and differences between community music approaches and popular music education. How are they kind of the same, and where are the areas where they might be different, and offer us a little, you know, value to kind of understand those things. So with that in mind, my hope for today is to unpack elements of popular music education and community music, see where they overlap and where there might be these unique value propositions, and then use eudaimonia as a lens through which to look at these perspectives and see what makes sense, and maybe how we can kind of move forward in understanding. So as we move forward, it's important, because these are broad umbrella terms, popular music education and community music, I want to talk about how I'm defining those things. There's 2 large communities that Gareth and I recognized from our work with the Association for Popular Music Education, and in part the Journal of Popular Music Education. There's music education in kind of school contexts, largely avocationally focused with K-12 teachers, pre-service music teacher educators. It uses popular music to bridge that gap between school music and music in society. And it uses rock band instruments, guitars, ukuleles, does some songwriting, some music technology, sometimes beat making, depending on the school. But it's that kind of contingency of the popular music education community. And then there is the vocationally focused artist development, higher popular music ed, that includes preparation for the music industry, music business, that focuses on getting gigs. And so there are other elements of popular music education. For example, in the United States, we have a for-profit organization called School of Rock. It was also a movie with Jack Black. And you can go take lessons, and they'll teach you to play, you know, rock instruments. There's an increasing number of online Rocksmith and Musician and Fender Play softwares that use popular music to teach you. And so there are other ways that popular music education can look. But for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus on popular music education largely within school context. So that first group, where it's music education and it's using popular music to those ends. Speaking of definitions, defining popular music is something that I think would be useful for our discussions today. It can be, yes, music that is popular, but for me, it is more of that second definition there, the definition of popular meaning of the people. And so I always found it useful in my work to think of popular music education as music of the people. My people as a teacher are my students. And so popular music is music of my students. That might be commercially popular music, but it could also be folk music that's important to them. It could also be music that is decidedly unpopular. If I have students that are into doom metal, for example, I might find a way to incorporate that in the classroom, even though that's not popular music. And so as we look at popular music education or popular music pedagogies, it can be, yes, the designs and practices and methods for teaching popular music, but I find the Bowman article, of which I think he thanks Roger Manti somewhere in the beginning of that article, I find this definition to be useful, characterized by amateur engagement, informality, a commitment to the process of making music, and a focus on pragmatic, functional musicianship skills that will serve students in a variety of contexts. Oh, I've clicked on something. There we go. So in the United States, there's been a large increase of popular music in school-based contexts, in part due to the modern band kind of movement that's been happening here. Internationally, the work of Musical Futures and other organizations have really started to spread popular music. It's interesting to look at the sales of ukuleles in the last decade. At a time when guitar sales have plateaued or are kind of, dwindling a little bit as technologies become the ways in which people are creating popular music, ukulele sales have skyrocketed, selling, 350% more than it did a decade ago. And a lot of it, I think, can be attributed to the presence of ukulele in school classrooms. It's not uncommon now for elementary general music, which if you're not from the United States, kind of ages 6 through 12-ish, to include ukulele in that music making experience. And so what does this look like in the classroom? I want to say that this is an ideal version of what popular music education can look like. It doesn't always look like this. Sometimes it looks like dad rock, where the director is just playing like the Eagles and the Rolling Stones, and the students don't have any choice. And so that's not what I'm talking about here. I'm talking about teacher as facilitator, incorporating informal learning, non-formal teaching, focusing on equity, access, inclusion, and diversity, incorporating songwriting and culturally relevant musics, focused on meaningful participation over excellence, something that June talked about earlier, where the teacher can sit alongside the student as co-learner. On that last one, we're going to talk more about amateurism and what that looks like, and how maybe amateurism doesn't cover all the elements of community music and popular music education, and talking about leveraging the cultural capital of the students. So that's kind of where I'm coming from when I'm talking about popular music education. On the flip side, within community music, I mentioned earlier that I did these kind of community music meetups without really understanding kind of the research on there. For example, I would not call what I did an active intervention at that time. Looking back on it later, I think there are elements of that. It was intergenerational, it was parents, it was students from the school, it was students who didn't come from the school, it was their friends, it was just anyone who wanted to show up. As some others have talked about in previous sessions, oftentimes we kind of started with the jam and we would make some music. I've got a video of that. We would bring in members of the community. This is on the left here, this is Sekou. And Sekou would come in and lead us through some musical experiences. We brought in different musicians each month that we did this. Here's a little video of one of those kind of opening jams. And usually we would start with an opening jam. Could people hear that? Let me. Yeah. But I shared my audio okay? Hold on, I've got to pull up there. Oh, I get the thumbs up. Fantastic. All right, back to eating lunch. Thank you. Because I have another audio clip at the very end that if we missed out on it, that would be sad. And then sometimes people would pick up a mic and they would start rapping or just kind of like stylized talking. Sometimes people would bring in their own instruments. Because I had mostly popular music instruments, a lot of these instruments came from Central Park East 2, which if you're familiar with any of the kind of approaches in progressive music education. Central Park East has long played a role in that. I shared a building with Central Park East too in my cohabited space. So again, there was this element of community music. We used popular music, but I didn't fully understand kind of the definitions. And I want to unpack a few of those now. And here's a few, and I'm going to synthesize these into one that Lee Higgins put together, but it's controlled by members of that community. These activities are, it's about active enjoyment and participation in music. You don't have to be part of a geographical community. I think that's especially pertinent in times now where our ideas of community are being expanded and pushed through deterritorialized space. And there are communities in which we belong that are not geographically based. The starting point is the competencies and ambitions of the participant rather than the teacher or leader. So it starts with the participant, it starts with those engaged, and then it moves out from there. It's not necessarily me as the teacher deciding what we do, it's a collective decision. And it focuses on collaborative music making, community development, and personal growth. To summarize, because I think this kind of hits on it, Lee Higgins talks about broad perspectives for community music being music of a community, communal music making, and the active intervention between a music leader or leaders and participants. So for the purposes of this talk, I want to use that third definition, not just because that's the one that Lee focuses on in his 2012 book, which I think is greatly informative, but because I see the most intersections between popular music education in the classroom and this kind of active intervention. And those are the things that I want to unpack. So here are some traits of community musicians. They're committed to the idea that everybody has the right and ability to make music. It's accessible. There's a flexible facilitation as well as flexible relationships with members. It's about social and personal growth as being more important than the musical growth. Oh, sorry. It focuses on lifelong music learning, a term we're going to unpack a little bit later. It emphasizes a variety and diversity of musics that reflect the community, locality, individual. It is about being inclusive of the disenfranchised and disadvantaged individual groups, and it recognizes the value of music to foster intercultural acceptance and understanding. Hopefully, you're already making connections between popular music in the classroom and community music. I want to touch on a couple of these before moving forward to see how Eudaimonia might help us make sense of some of these if we can use that as a framework. So the role of the teacher facilitator is a commonality between community music and popular music education. Community musicians' attitudes are often expressed in terms of facilitation. As I said earlier, there are flexible facilitation models. We'll talk about what that flexibility looks like in terms of unconditional hospitality shortly. Price, who is involved with the, David Price, who's involved with the Musical Futures movement, or was involved before handing it off, he identified these areas of competence for a facilitator in community music settings, and it focuses on interpersonal skills, social and political awareness, organizational skills, motivational skills, music tastelessness, meaning that they value multiple forms of music, fluency in multiple musical languages, facilitation skills, and technological skills. However, whenever we're involving a facilitator or someone who has a role as a leader of sorts, it steers the learning process. You know, in fact, Lee Higgins talks about the nature of the intervention alters the dynamic and the power relationship that leader seeks to have with the group. And we're going to see that in popular music education as well. The teacher as facilitator role in popular music education has become one that's been popular and is showing up more and more in the research literature, as we're seeing the role of the music teacher is not really a director. They're not up there beating 4-4, you know, with their baton. It is about facilitation skills, constructivist learning approaches, student-centered elements. And then the teacher takes cues from the group when to inject themselves, when to step out, when to let students kind of go through that in the deep end informal learning experiences and have epiphany moments, or when the facilitator might need to step in. Again, this is an ideal version of popular music education. There are a lot of versions that are very teacher driven. Teacher chooses the repertoire, teacher chooses how the rehearsal is going to go. So looking at from the popular music education, even in the idyllic setting, that relationship and that power structure of the individual is one that popular music educators are aware of, because just the nature of having an educator in the band, taking a tradition that develops in garages and basements with friends of your choosing, and now you're in a school in your class and you don't get to pick your bandmates maybe, although Musical Future supports selection of friendship groups, and then you're a teacher and you've got to give a grade that plays with that dynamic. There is a power relationship there. And so working through those areas are things that I think popular music education facilitators are constantly aware of. Another commonality is the idea of training and certification. It's really common all over the States and other places where you can get a degree in music education. Degrees in music, community music, are fewer. There are grad degrees that are propping up. NYU has one. York St. John is where the International Center for Community Music is. We're seeing more and more master's degrees in community music, but there's also a little bit of, there's tension between community music and formalized education, in part because higher education tends to take practices and kind of sanitize certain ideologies and kind of in the colonial way claim things as their own. And the challenge is that if we as researchers and higher ed folk colonize this thing and make it our own, oftentimes the people doing that have little connection to the actual practice of music making with people. And we're going to find a commonality within popular music. The ones who are doing it in the classroom aren't really the ones that have that experience. There's a lot of research out there that says that, you know, music teachers feel ill-prepared to facilitate popular music ensembles in the classroom, and that's makes sense. I mean, who becomes a music education major? It's people that won at the game of school music. And so they had success and they're like, oh, I'm good at school music, so I'll be a school music teacher. And then to get into university, they have to audition using Western European classical focused traditions. And so if you're a DJ or an EDM or a producer, chances are you're not going to be able to find a place to get into school music, nor would you want to, because you look at school music and you're like, well, that doesn't reflect the experiences that are relevant to me. And so as a result, we have teachers who want to incorporate popular music and want to expand access to school music, but they themselves don't have the skill sets or the experiences previously to incorporate that into the classroom. And so we end up, as Lucy Green talks about, with this like ghost version of popular music in the classroom, not the thing itself. So training and certification necessary to be a music educator. In a community music setting, the training and certification, in some ways, there's a, you know, if you're trying to get a degree, for example, in like hip hop, if I say, oh, I have a degree in hip hop, well, what does that mean? And that doesn't necessarily give you the street cred. And in some ways, going to academia for certification in something that kind of is going to be learned informally might be problematic when it comes to you know, credibility within that community. So training and certification is something to think about. Inclusivity and access, things I've already talked about, so I'll go through this a little bit quickly. At the heart of community music is inclusivity and participation. It is including the disenfranchised and disadvantaged groups. It's providing opportunities for every individual. So that is inclusive of students with disabilities, students who don't want to play traditional instruments, people from all socioeconomic statuses, refugees, et cetera, finding opportunities for every individual to engage in music making, practicing that idea of unconditional hospitality. Again, unconditional hospitality is not just about welcoming them in, but it's also influencing what we do when they're in. So if I am a community music facilitator and I have a plan for what we're going to do, and then people show up and they're like, no, that's not really what we want to do. Unconditional hospitality is going to welcome these new perspectives, and I'm going to be changed, and I'm going to have to be flexible. When we look at from the popular music education, oh, I think you've figured this out. I meant to say that blue is popular music education and black is community music. There's a little legend on the top right corner. If we look at popular music education, there's some research there that because just from the idea that we're adding a new option, It's more likely to include marginalized populations that feel excluded from traditional music practices. Again, previous sessions have talked about that as well. And there's some research there that when you're adding a rock band or a popular music ensemble or a modern band, student participants are more likely, it's more likely going to attract students of color and students who are on a free and reduced lunch, which is a lower SES designation. One time I was typing a thing with Gareth and he asked me if free and reduced lunch was like an American weight loss plan, where you got a reduced lunch as part of a fitness regimen. So I want to explain that for our international audience. Half the time I think Gareth is just like pulling my leg, and I don't think actual British people would think that, but we'll find out. Ownership of the music, another key element. So there's individual and group ownership in community music practices. It reflects the cultural life of the participants. There's an emphasis on the variety and diversity of musics. And so unlike, again, maybe some traditional approaches to music participation where students don't see themselves reflected, or as June was talking earlier, all the composers are men and I don't see myself reflected there. This is focused on that, on the individual and group ownership, on reflecting the cultural life of the community and the individual. From the popular music side as well, students are involved in the choices regarding repertoire, style, instrumentation. It reflects their musical identities, which in turn can empower these students. And as we talked about a handful of hours ago, you know, we as humans inscribe meaning to music that is valuable to us, and we are involved in that. If you want to cite that last one, it was June from the Q&A or Halpin from 3 hours ago. Just want to make sure I give them credit. Focusing on lifelong music making. This is another commonality between community music and popular music education. Checking my time, 4 minutes. Again, this is different than lifelong learning. Manti talks about how when we do, we learn, but if the focus is on the learning, that's part of this kind of neoliberal element that removes the joy in the doing. And so there is value in focusing on the doing. With community music practices, that intergenerational aspect and the emphasizing of lifelong engagement is centered to that work. In popular music education, I feel like it goes both ways. You know, there is this element, again, that Manti and Tucker talk about, where oftentimes in school music, the goal is just to get them to their senior year of band, and then that's kind of our only responsibility to them. Whereas popular music education engages with the instruments that society uses to make music, guitar, bass, drums, keys, technology, iPads, beat making, things like that. Rarely is it intergenerational. That is in large part because in schools you're working with students, and it is difficult to bring people into the community, into the classroom. I know in some schools there's a whole waiver process where they have to be fingerprinted and cleared. And so one of the differences when we think about lifelong music making is community music is actually engaging an intergenerational participant pool in the activity of music making. Oftentimes in popular music education, it's setting students up to be able to make music for the rest of their lives, but it's not really intergenerational in that element. So again, one of those differences. If we look at instruments sold throughout, I think this is the NAMM list from 2016, you can see that, you know, guitars and ukuleles dwarf the sale of all concert band instruments combined. But if we can expand our notions to think about how people are actually making popular music using technology, iPad sold dwarfs all of those other instruments by, you know, many-fold. So kind of expanding what school music can look like is an opportunity for popular music education. I'm going to move quickly because I'm running out of time, but informal learning and non-formal teaching at the heart of both approaches, community music and popular music. One of the challenges in school music is that even when informal learning is used, it is sometimes at odds with, well, I'm going to incorporate informal learning practices, but also I feel like I have to teach them traditional music staff notation because that's what a good music teacher would do. There's this expectation put on music teachers of like, even if you're doing this other thing, well, yeah, what if they want to major in music and they can't because they don't know theory because you never taught it to them? There's this kind of cognitive dissonance, even with teachers doing popular music in the classroom of like, well, but I should probably also teach them this other thing. Whereas in a community music setting, the preconceived ideas of what should be taught are ideally a reflection of what the participants' goals are, and not this kind of like peer pressure from dead people thing. There are social concerns at the heart of community music, you know, personal and communal connections, focusing on empowering students. Same thing with, or participants, same thing within popular music education. Popular music education helps students construct personal identity and interpersonal social experiences, especially through collaborative songwriting, you know, performing music that is relevant to students and the community. Last one before we talk about the eudaimonic lens here. The idea of amateur engagement, you know, the root of amateur comes from this idea of to love, which has been well documented, especially on people who are advocating for expanding beyond this model of excellence focused music education. Community music is, can fall within that amateur engagement, but also this idea of community music as an intervention that seeks change and transformation, I think sets it apart from some elements of amateur engagement. Because, for example, if I'm picking up my ukulele and I'm playing some songs because it brings me joy and I like engaging in ukulele playing in a community, that doesn't necessarily lead to a change and transformation. So I think sometimes the focus of community music as an intervention towards change and transformation might separate itself from this idea of amateur engaging in music as leisure because it is pleasurable. And we've been playing with that idea of leisure and who has leisure and what does that term mean and how do we situate it against ideas of work. And so this is an area where I feel like I need to drill down a little bit more, because I feel like in popular music education, the amateur idea is about meaningful participation, finding joy in music, giving them skills to make music throughout the rest of their life, where in the community music element with this active intervention and change and transformation, it might be at odds with that. Again, I would love your input because that's something I'm still kind of wrestling with. So in the few minutes that I have left, let's look at some of the eudaimonic elements and see how they might help us make sense. And this is going to be really quick. Gareth, you're probably telling me I have less than 1 minute. So ideas of living well, human flourishing, true purpose, pursuing intrinsic goals, behaving in autonomous and volitional ways. Apologies that I'm going so quickly, but I'm running out of time. You know, participant, if we look at community music and popular music education, participant choice is a central focus there. There's an emphasis on the variety that reflect the cultural lives of the individual community and the locality. And so there's this connection to the individual. It's not just that if you're in a band and you're a cog in this larger machine that produces something that's very great, but you are there to serve the larger. There's an element of individual focus within community music and popular music education that values the identities of the students, that the social and personal growth is more important than the end result. Again, meaningful participation over excellence. I think pursuing one's true purpose indicates that there are purposes, plural. My true purpose might be different than your true purpose. And if we're both just cogs in a machine to produce something at the end, our true purpose isn't necessarily aligned with this thing that we're doing. But when our individual goals are honored and our musical identities are put forth, then we can say that there are musical futures, plural, and not just one destination that we're all heading. So a couple quick quotes that I won't read in their entirety, but human flourishing is about not just betterment for yourself, but your community as well. The growth of an individual is seen as intertwined with the flourishing of others. I think this is at the heart of community music and popular music education. It's not just about the individual, although the individual and their identity is prized. It is about the collective good. And in a eudaimonic way, when a person works to bring about these positive changes, it's about valuing themselves and others. And so we flourish collectively when others are accepted and included. And I think if we're doing meaning making here and we're putting our weight down, I think that's the unique proposition for community music and popular music education, even though they have their differences, when it's focused on the individual and the collective as equally important. And in the words of Gareth's grad students,
yeah, we out here trying to flourish.
Oh, and then there's supposed to be a wah, wah, wah. That's all right. All right, I'm done. Thank you.